and welcome to Brownie Ponders, in which I, an actual brownie, ponder over matters of philosophy, politics, psychology, sociology, and so on. I know the reference to Korea in the title is what brought you here, which was very much on purpose, but I was actually hoping to rope you into confronting the bigger issue of cultural idealization and ignorance. Recently, I've been stumbling across all sorts of stories and research articles concerning these phenomena in the context of the South Korean pop culture wave, aka the Hallyu wave, and honestly, while I've always been aware that these mindsets and misconceptions exist, I didn't pay much attention to how common and problematic they really are. I feel that a lot of the intercultural issues humans run into can be attributed to a myriad of variables, but at the very core of these variables is a profound lack of realism. Let's break this down further, but before we get started, I will reiterate that all points expressed over the course of this video are a product of my personal opinions, perspectives, and perceptions. Don't treat it as fact because it isn't. Also, I'd like to apologize in advance for the background noise. It's raining. I recently read two articles pertaining to the research findings of Minju Lee, a postdoctoral fellow at Indiana University Bloomington. Lee's research explored something that she calls the Netflix effect. Loosely defined, this phenomenon refers to the magnetic effect of Korean pop culture through hit television shows, novels, music, and other forms of entertainment, and specifically their appeal in the eyes of Western women. In the later half of the 2010s, South Korean media has grown dramatically in popularity, spreading from its initially local relevance to global proportions. K-pop, K-dramas, K-beauty, these terms would have been largely foreign 10 years ago to a non-Korean audience, but they are widespread, popular, and in high demand currently. International audiences are ravenously consuming South Korean media, becoming enchanted with the nuances of Korean culture. I would consider this to be relatively normal in the context of moderation. After all, it's human nature to become enthralled and exhilarated by foreign stimulus. There are plenty of individuals who like anime from Japan, fashion from France, history from England, art from Ghana, architecture from Turkey, and so on. The Netflix effect, however, refers to a level of affinity for a culture, specifically Korean culture, in the context of Lee's research, that exceeds moderate interest. Lee observed that there has been a significant influx of female young single Western tourists pouring into Seoul, South Korea. According to government data, in 2005, South Korea received 2.3 million female visitors as opposed to 2.9 million male visitors. Compare this to 2019, in which South Korea received a whopping 10 million female visitors as opposed to 6.7 million males. Further piquing Lee's interest, a large portion of these women were not following the patterns one might expect a tourist to. An average tourist would squeeze as many attractions as possible into an international stay, visiting cafes, historical sites, and attractions. But these Western, single, relatively young tourists were spending the brunt of their daytime hours in their hostels, consuming Korean entertainment materials, and when nighttime came around, they were venturing out to hit up traditional nightlife establishments such as bars and nightclubs. Lee visited 8 youth hostels and interviewed 123 women about these patterns and the reason behind their behavior. Most came from Europe and North America, were in their 20s, and had traveled to South Korea primarily because of a self-proclaimed fascination with Korean men. Portrayed in pop culture as in touch with their effeminate sides, sensitive, protective, gentlemanly, and pure, many of these women wanted South Korean men as romantic partners. Many reported feeling as if the dating scene in their own home countries was bleak and over-sexualized, and that their native prospective partners often had unsavory ulterior motives and one-track minds. They considered Korean men to be cultured, according to Lee, and perceived them to care for their physical appearance to a far greater degree than most Western men. Grace, a 25-year-old gardener from the UK, reported traveling to Seoul in 2021 after watching the K-drama Crash Landing on You via Netflix. She liked how women were not jeered at and catcalled, as is fairly common in the Western world. In her own words, Korean men are gentlemanly, polite, charming, romantic, fairy tale-like, chivalrous, and respectful. Englishmen, in comparison, are half-drunk and holding a beer. Again, her words, not mine. Later in the article, Lee speaks about other subjects of her research who admitted to being very disappointed with the dating scene once they got down on the ground. One subject was groped and jeered at and treated as if she was an easy fling because of the fairly common Asian stereotype that foreign women, especially from Western countries, are more promiscuous, vulgar, and desperate compared to their Asian counterparts. And even in spite of discovering these realities, some of Lee's research subjects maintained that they would return to Korea in search of their dream partner. Some even felt that it was their own fault that they hadn't been able to find the right man. What I took away from this is not necessarily that Western women think Korean men are completely perfect, but rather that there's a lot of cultural ignorance as well as idealization out there that is proving to be harmful to a significant number of people. And this ignorance and idealization, specifically in a cultural context, has its roots in something called a hyperreality. Television shows, books, and other forms of fictional entertainment are often based upon reality, but they're slightly different. Netflix's ongoing hit period drama Bridgerton, for example, is set in England's Regency period, therefore it is derivative of the actual era. The Bridgerton universe is an English Regency hyperreality. A hyperreality is defined as an image or simulation, or an aggregate of images and simulations that either distorts the reality it purports to depict, or does not in fact depict anything with a real existence at all, but which nonetheless comes to constitute reality. In essence, a hyperreality takes reality and distorts it in such ways that is not always is impossible but may not be quite probable either. So while the events of Camp Rock could technically happen, they realistically and most probably will not. This is the dilemma posed by the countless hyperrealities created in fictional media. They linger between the realms of realistic probability and technical possibility. And if the average American will watch 5,000 movies in their lifetime, how much of an impact will this hyperreality have on their outlook on actual life? Why confront and accept the bleakness of our realistic prospects when we could live projecting our dreams and ideals onto those bleak prospects? The answer is because doing so is infantile, a poor coping mechanism, and has negative effects on both the idealizer and the person, thing, place, or concept being idealized. And before you say not everyone believes and wants what they see in movies, let me stop you right there and tell you that you're absolutely right. I don't think anyone's dying to have Freddy Krueger show up at their door or wants to be dropped into the Bird Box universe, but this is because these genres, sci-fi, horror, thrillers, mysteries, and tragedies, are typically far-fetched enough from reality that we can't logically overlap the two. Also, they're horrible hyperrealities anyway. Nobody really wants to be a part of them, so much as we like to watch that horror unfold with gleeful cruelty. Dramatic and or romantic hyperrealities, conversely, are close enough to reality so we can get behind them. Falling in love is something many humans want, naturally. Unlike the undesirable hyperrealities of non-romantic and far-fetched genres, romantic hyperrealities are beautifully and carefully crafted to elicit a mishmash of jealousy, longing, and delight in viewers. This keeps humans coming back for more and more of this addictive material, building an even greater hyperreality wrought with misconceptions, unrealistic standards and ideals, and stereotypes that are then carried into their lives where the effects wreak havoc. The subjects of Lee's study who traveled to Seoul in search of love essentially dedicated themselves to recreating the hyperreality of the Korean dramas and romances they consume regularly. Of course, I think all of us can agree that's a bit of an extreme result of carrying misconceptions from movies into real life, but it's still a result. What do all romance movies, series, and novels have in common? A main character, and by proxy of living largely in a hyperreality, a significant number of people are bound to soak up that concept, hence the prevalence of main character syndrome. Main character syndrome, or a pop psychology term referring to self-centered and out-of-touch individuals, is becoming more and more common these days. What with social media, movies, and novels flooding everyone's consciousness with the narrative that things take place from the point of view of a single or small group of individuals, it would be hard not to, at some point, lose touch with reality briefly, and maybe focus a bit more than we should on the events of our personal life. But all in all, you should ultimately be able to grow up and reconcile the fact that in the grand scheme of existence, your problems are insignificant and minuscule. The problem with individuals too invested in a hyperreality is that they aren't able to reattach themselves with reality. While it's all great to have confidence and invest time in learning about yourself, it's a well-established truth that humans quite easily fall prey to self-absorption and narcissism. There's a big difference between acknowledging your self-worth and inflating that same sense of self-worth. For example, look at 90 Day Fiancé, the dumpster fire TLC show that no one can seem to stop watching. And for those of you who are fortunate enough to not know about the show, 90 Day Fiancé is a reality television show in which foreigners spend 90 days on a fiancé visa trying to schnook an old, desperate, entitled American person into marrying them. On the show, it's common to see couples that are mismatched, to say the least. A common trend is a much older American person in their 50s, 60s, or even 70s meeting foreigners that are in their 20s and 30s and sometimes even teens online. You don't have to be a genius to figure out that these relationships aren't 100% genuine. After all, why would a 20-something-year-old model want to be in a relationship with a condescending 60-year-old who has kids older than they are? It's not called ageism, it's called reality. Your inherent self-worth isn't tied to your age, looks, or money, but it doesn't hurt to ask yourself, what would someone so different get out of a relationship with me? And this question isn't depreciating, it's reflective, because humans are humans, and pretty much across the board, they're the same. This has the potential to be a good and a bad thing. When you find yourself watching a K-drama in the future, take a minute to not only look at the male lead, but the female lead. What do you see? The female Korean beauty standard, just as the male lead often fits the Korean male beauty standard. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but the vast majority of Westerners don't even come close to meeting these standards. Sure, a Westerner's blondness or green eyes may come across as exotic or peculiar to other nationalities, but that doesn't make them automatically appealing. And please don't take this as me saying Westerners are ugly. Everyone's beautiful in their own way, but that doesn't mean they'll automatically be beautiful to everyone else. Beauty standards are hard enough for natives to meet, much less non-natives. For example, the Korean beauty standard values an exceedingly slender build and low body weight. What a Westerner would consider a normal weight would be considered fat in South Korea, and what a Westerner would consider curvy would be considered downright obese. I've heard Korean women who are 5'5" or 5'6" and 120 pounds say they think they should weigh anywhere between 90 and 110 pounds. According to a 2020 CDC report, roughly 74% of American adults are overweight, and 36.5% of American adults are obese. All in all, most Americans don't fit Korea's beauty standards as far as weight. And stepping away from physical beauty standards, there are behavioral standards to conform to as well. Americans tend to be more outspoken than their Asian counterparts. Let's be honest, they're louder than any of their counterparts, really. This outspoken, transparent nature may be quirky and fun initially, but in day-to-day interactions, it can get on people's nerves. The constant high volume, the lack of appropriate boundaries and entitlement, the stifling self-importance, and individualism, the monopolization of conversation could easily exhaust and scare off non-Westerners. And there's the previously mentioned stereotype that Westerners are morally loose and promiscuous. Like what happened to some of the women involved in Lee's research, Westerners may not receive the princely treatment that they hope for. A good, obedient, traditional, lovely Korean gentleman will likely marry a good, gentlemanly, traditional Korean lady. Otherwise, they wouldn't be very familial, rule-abiding men, now would they? And it's terribly unlikely that one would find these men mingling at bars and nightclubs frequented by foreigners. Chances are a person you casually picked up at a bar isn't looking for their soulmate. And that's because entering an established relationship and settling down is a whole separate thing from messing around in a nightclub. One particular thing that one of Lee's subjects mentioned ties perfectly into this sentiment. The subject said, "Why can't we go to dinner first? It's so crass. They, Korean men, know Korean women won't tolerate it." And she's right. When there's a cultural barrier and the native party perceives the foreign party to be socially isolated and ignorant of cultural norms, they'll overstep boundaries and forgo proper, respectful treatment, using the nuances and niches of their culture to bamboozle and manipulate the foreign party. This applies to all cultures, not just South Korea. Notwithstanding cultural norms, one should also mind Korea's very real issues. For example, Grace the gardener mentioned Englishmen being half drunk all the time. Well, she'll be glad to know that South Korea is unironically the drinking capital of the world. It's not abnormal for people to board the train reeling from a hangover on the way to work. Sexism is also a prominent issue in Korea. Being a relatively traditional and conservative society, feminism is not terribly popular in Korea. On the contrary, there is a subculture of vehement anti-feminists in the country. South Korean Olympic archer An Sun was criticized and berated with misogynistic statements because she wore her hair cropped to the Tokyo Olympics for comfort. That's not to say that Koreans are all sexist, but that it's worth paying attention to a particular trend in a society. Just like I would tell anyone fascinated with America that they should watch out for public spaces on account of mass shooters. Not every American is a shooter, but it's a prominent issue over here. I'm sure if you search for the downsides of South Korean culture, you could find plenty, so I'm not really going to dig any deeper into that. The main point of this segment is that not only do most foreigners typically diverge from a culture's standards and norms, but their expectation of that culture may not be taking into account the very real issues entrenched in the society. Realize your self-worth, but make sure to stay rooted in reality, because, as my grandpa used to say, if it's too good to be true, then it probably is. So far, we've been talking a lot about how cultural norms and idealization can harm the outsider. Now we're going to switch things up and talk about how the outsider's expectations can harm the insiders. The thing is, the more fantastical your expectations are, the more you're going to resent and despise the real thing. The bigger expectations are, the harder they fall, so to speak. Unrealistic expectations are hard enough to combat in our own native communities. How many people do you already know harboring unmeetable expectations that border on delirium? Take that and multiply it times 1,000 when applied to foreign cultures. There are plenty of people who think Frenchmen are romantic, passionate, and artistic individuals, but their fellow Frenchmen and women wouldn't quite agree. They perceive Frenchmen to be moody and self-important. No offense to all the lovely Frenchmen out there, I'm really laying into Europeans today. Whether negative or positive expectations can be problematic. There's nothing wrong with having a general idea of what a certain demographic or country might feel like, but it shouldn't be anything more than that, an idea. The key difference between an idea and an expectation is that an idea is a simple impression and an expectation is an inflexible, preconceived notion. Only something inflexible can be shattered. An idea which is flexible can be stretched, while expectations will be shattered. I cannot stress the importance of having a sense of realism enough, and realism is not to be confused with cynicism. Cynicism is characterized by an unnecessarily negative outlook on life, while realism is simply being honest with life, whether that be the good or the bad of it. Realism is a pivotal life skill to develop to both protect ourselves and safeguard others from our stupidity. And to develop realism is essentially to develop mental fortitude, because we need fortitude to handle life. We need to be strong for the challenges we'll all undoubtedly encounter. Part of this process is accepting that we may dearly want something that may not sound too outlandish. We may not get it anyway. For example, a fairy tale relationship. But that doesn't mean we don't get to be happy. You'll only find yourself unhappy if you maintain these expectations in the back of your mind. If you truly drop them and develop more realistic goals and ideals, you won't have that bitterness towards life. And I know all of this is easier said than done, but here's a little 3-step exercise that might help the next time you're bummed out because people don't live up to your standards. Step 1 is to ask yourself, free of justification, could you or would you meet your own standards? Step 2 is to ask yourself, in the grand scheme of things, is your expectations not being met really that prominent of an issue? And step 3 is to step back and reflect upon your thought processes all the way back from the moment your expectations were shattered. Cross-examine the essence of your expectations and what that says about you and your outlook on life and the people around you. There are certain universal truths that we must acknowledge, and one such truth is that humans, no matter their race, gender, age, nationality, and so on, they're pretty much the same. They're kind of like pizzas. It's the same general base with a few different toppings scattered here and there, and that's about the extent of their nuances. But humans love to magnify these differences and make a huge deal out of them. One of Lee's research subjects said, "Men are men, humans are alike everywhere." And again, she's right. Men are men, women are women, and humans are humans. They pretty much have the same objectives no matter what country you go to, just a slightly different variation. Just like there are women pouring into South Korea, there are plenty of Koreans pouring out of South Korea, frustrated with their own culture or fascinated by another. You know what they say, the grass is always greener on the other side. Humans are perpetually envious, eyeing each other's things, dipping their fingers into it, and then realizing it's kind of a lateral move from what they're familiar with. Comparison is the death of joy after all. The Hallyu wave has taken the world by storm, and while we can all appreciate fire noodles, skincare, and the easy-to-learn Korean language, there can in fact be too much of a good thing such as interest in Korean or any other culture. According to researcher Lee, this has manifested in the form of a massive flood of single Western women flooding into Korea in search of their dreamboat. The problem with this is that there are just as many dreamboats in Korea as there are in any other country, reason being that humans are humans. The idealization and ignorance behind the notion that South Korean men are somehow flawless is harmful to both Westerners and Koreans alike. It's important when interacting with and exploring other cultures to keep a strong grip on reality and be sure of what to expect. No country is perfect. Why else are humans constantly pouring out of their countries and into others? There's no such thing as a perfect man, just like there isn't a perfect woman. There are only people, and that's good enough. You'll have to make do with reality. Thank you for taking the time to hear me rant essentially about Koreaboos. I sincerely hope that you're not a Koreaboo because that would make this very awkward. If you are, please get help. South Korea is an amazing country, but that doesn't justify your weirdness. Also, sponsor me, HBarn. That's all for now. Have a great day.